Hey guys, tonight we're headed somewhere dim and dripping, where the water's not warm and the punishment is cold and public. Imagine this: you're strapped to a rickety wooden chair. Your ankles bound the ropes, creaking with every nervous breath. A crowd gathers at the riverbank, whispering and laughing as they await your grand entrance into the shallows. Then, splash. You're submerged not once, not twice, but again and again, bobbing like an unwilling apple at a very damp village fair. Welcome to the world of medieval ducking stools, where justice was wet, wobbly, and honestly a little ridiculous. You probably won't survive this with your dignity intact, let alone your dry socks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle through a mucky English village street sometime around the 1500s. The air is ripe with damp wool and the unmistakable scent of turnips. Somewhere ahead, there's a small wooden platform perched above a pond, a river or a purpose-built pit filled with delightfully putrid water. This is the ducking stool, a charming contraption that looks like a seesaw met a medieval interrogation chair. You already know someone's about to take an unexpected bath, and spoiler, it's not voluntary. The ducking stool was a public punishment mostly aimed at women labeled scolds, gossips, or troublemakers, a conveniently broad definition that could mean anything from too much chatting to actual slander. The idea was simple: strap the accused into a chair attached to a long beam, swing them out over the water, and dunk them repeatedly. Sometimes gently, sometimes not. The experience wasn't meant to drown, although awkwardly it sometimes did, but to humiliate. And trust me, it worked. Imagine being dunked in your full woolen skirt and apron with the entire village watching, some probably taking wagers on how long you can hold your breath. It wasn't just cold, it was status-ruining. Even after your sentence was over, you'd carry the soggy shame for weeks. Also, pneumonia, but mostly shame. Interestingly, ducking stools weren't just for the chatty. In some towns, they extended the punishment to men, particularly dishonest tradesmen. A butcher who weighed his meat with a heavy thumb might find himself teetering over the stream in his best doublet, the local kids jeering from the banks. Gender equity in public humiliation. What progress! And not all stools were stationary. Enter the cucking stool, an older cousin often mobile. Some versions were mounted on wheels like a primitive parade float of disgrace pushed through the town square before arriving at the water's edge. This meant your punishment started long before you got wet. You'd be rolled past neighbors' in-laws, and that guy who still owes you money, your hands bound a frilly bonnet falling into your eyes. Then the splash finale. Historians still argue whether these punishments were genuinely meant as reformative measures, or if they were closer to community theater with a splash zone. One camp insists the ducking stool was a deterrent, an early attempt at maintaining order without inflicting permanent harm. Another points out the inherent spectacle of it all. It was less about justice and more about giving bored villagers something to talk about on Sunday. And speaking of talking, there's this wonderful fringe theory that the ducking process was partly designed to cool the tongue, as if plunging someone into murky water would literally chill their gossiping ways. A kind of hydraulic behavioral reset, if you will. Science may not support it, but it's delightfully poetic. But not every ducking was created equal. In some areas, local customs got creative. In Leominster, England, records show that one ducking stool was set up on a river raft, floating into view like a soggy barge of retribution. Other towns had permanent installations, little jetties with built-in pulleys like the world's worst water ride. And let's not overlook the theatrical timing. Some duckings were saved for market days when crowds were guaranteed. Justice, after all, is best served in front of a full audience. One standout case from 1745 involved Jenny Pipes, a woman in Leicestershire, who was ducked no fewer than 3 times for allegedly foul speech. Her last plunge was reportedly during a frost. Yes, winter duckings were very much a thing. Because nothing says lesson learned like emerging from a half-frozen pond with icicles in your hair and a goose pecking at your sleeve. By the 18th century, ducking stools began to fade out, replaced by less aquatic punishments. But some towns kept them around well into the 1800s, as quaint relics like historical theme parks with unfortunate accessories. Tourists could gawk, and locals could remember when backtalk meant bracing for a swim. And yet, oddly enough, the stool never quite went extinct. In 1989, yes, you heard that Wright Village pranksters in the UK constructed a replica ducking stool as a light-hearted punishment during a summer fair. A volunteer dressed as a gossip was dunked for laughs. The tradition had looped fully into parody like medieval punishment cosplay. So, here you are, tiptoeing through centuries of damp justice, watching laughter blur with cruelty. The ducking stool wasn't the harshest tool in the medieval kit, but it had a certain flair. Cold, humiliating public, and bizarrely theatrical, it set the tone for a justice system that often preferred spectacle over subtlety. Next time you catch someone gossiping a little too loudly, just be glad we don't settle disputes with surprise river dips anymore. Unless it's summer, and you're both friends. And there's a very clear no ducking stool rule in place. You're trudging uphill now, the sound of your own rattling echoing down the muddy lane. The sky is gray, naturally, and the villagers have taken a break from their thrilling mud-collecting duties to watch you pass. Why? Because around your neck is a spiked iron collar so tight it makes swallowing feel like a dare. And jutting from your face is something even more arresting, an iron mask grimacing grotesquely with exaggerated ears and an open mouth frozen in an eternal scream. No, it's not Halloween. It's the Middle Ages, and you've just been introduced to one of their more artistic forms of public humiliation. The shame collar, sometimes paired with the iron mask, or, as it's occasionally known, the mask of infamy. These weren't one-size-fits-all punishments. Depending on your crime, your shameware could be custom-forged to reflect your moral failing. Spoke out of turn, expect a mask with a swollen tongue. Lied or gossiped. Maybe your mask will have donkey ears and a nose longer than your legal defense. It's like medieval custom emoji, except you can't take it off and it weighs several pounds. Now, it's not just the physical discomfort, though. Iron's not exactly known for its plush interior. It's the spectacle. These masks were meant to turn you into a walking caricature of your sin, often complete with bells or chains that jangled with every step. Think of it as the original walk of shame, but with an unventilated helmet and a potential tetanus bonus. The shame collar itself could be worn with or without the mask. It was often studded or edged with spikes, to discourage you from moving too freely or at all. These collars might be chained to walls posts, or even other offenders. Imagine spending your punishment day face-to-face with the butcher who oversalted his sausages last week. It's like a very unpleasant brunch with ex-friends. Historians still argue whether these devices were purely punitive or if they doubled as crowd control. Some believe they were used to discourage unrest during religious or market gatherings, make an example of one loudmouth, and maybe the others stay quiet during sermons. Others argue that it was a deeply psychological punishment engineered to grind your sense of identity into the dust. You weren't just uncomfortable, you were transformed into a living joke. There's also some debate over how long these punishments lasted. In some towns, a few hours might suffice. In others, offenders were sentenced to wear their iron shame until they collapsed from exhaustion or heat stroke. Iron, again, not being breathable. A mainstream historical record from 17th century Germany describes a woman forced to wear an iron mask shaped like a pig's head. Her crime, nagging her husband in public. And, while you can't really justify that punishment, you have to admit someone in the forge was having a very specific artistic day. Now, it wasn't all cruelty. In some cases, these masks and collars were reused, maintained, and displayed like trophies of law and order. One town in Belgium even kept theirs in the church vestibule, neatly hung beside the hymnals. Because nothing screams love thy neighbor like a collection of municipal head cages. And lest you think this was strictly a continental European phenomenon, think again. Shame collars and masks were documented in parts of England and Scotland well into the 1600s. There's even fringe speculation that a few of these masks made their way to the colonies, although evidence for that remains sketchy at best. As you stand there in your iron caricature, you notice the way villagers interact with you. Some jeer. Some avert their eyes. Children throw stones or worse apples. It was never fruit you'd want to eat, but others seem a little uncomfortable, like they're watching a performance they're not entirely sure is meant to be funny. And in that murky space between ridicule and reflection is where this punishment really lived. One particularly quirky tidbit. In parts of Bohemia, the mask wearer might be forced to recite rhyming apologies through the metal slats. Picture this you in an iron dog face mask trying to recite a humiliating poem while half the village snorts milk through their noses. Dignity. You left that back in the stocks. And while many of these masks were made from iron, some were even painted to accentuate their absurd features. Rosy cheeks, devilish eyebrows, painted lips. In one surviving example, the tongue of the mask has nails driven through it, not just symbolically discouraging speech, but actively preventing it. Medieval fashion was nothing if not intense, and yet in rare cases the punishment did work. There are scattered accounts, mainstream and otherwise, of townspeople who, after a single mask-wearing episode, never again raised their voice in church or gossiped at the well. Whether that's due to remorse or fear of repeat costume duty is anyone's guess. But the deeper question remains, were these punishments merciful alternatives to more severe physical torture, or simply new flavors of cruelty? For some, the mask was a light sentence compared to whipping or execution. For others, the psychological damage lingered for years long after the bells stopped ringing. You can still find a few of these masks today, locked behind glass in museums or hung in the rafters of old courthouses. And when you look at them, those bizarre, exaggerated expressions, you realize just how performative justice used to be. It wasn't enough to correct behavior. You had to become the warning poster, the cautionary tale with eye holes. So next time you hear someone say, "Speak your truth," be glad you're not doing it through 6 pounds of sweaty iron with donkey ears. The tavern was warm. A little too warm, really. The fire roared ale, sloshed from mug to lip to beard, and laughter shook the rafters as someone belted out a very off-key version of Greensleeves. You joined in enthusiastically, maybe too enthusiastically. One more drink. Sure, one more after that. Why not? You were the life of the party. Until the constable tapped you on the shoulder with something decidedly less fun than another pint. And now, well, now you're wearing a barrel. Welcome to the sobering world of the drunkard's cloak. You stand wobbling in the town square, your arms poking out of rough holes sawed into the sides of a large, empty beer cask. It's heavy. It smells like old hops and regret. And worst of all, you can't sit down. You can't really lie down either. You just shuffle slowly like a particularly shameful tortoise as the townsfolk titter behind their hands, and the local baker offers to roll you down the hill for sport. This punishment had its heyday in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in parts of England and Germany. The logic was deceptively simple. If you're going to act like a fool while drunk, you might as well look the part. Turn the empty vessel of your crime into your prison, and then put it on public display. Practical, not especially. Humiliating without a doubt. The drunkard's cloak wasn't standardized. Some were literal barrels sawed open crudely with splintery armholes. Others were purpose-built wooden cylinders banded with iron and decorated with painted slogans like "Beware excess" or "I'm not a gentleman." One German example had little bells affixed to the rim, so your every stumble came with festive jingles of disgrace. Sleigh bells, but sad, and as you totter awkwardly in your mobile pub prison, you're learning that this punishment isn't just about ridicule. It's also about logistics. You can't use your hands properly, your field of vision is awful, and your balance, well, you didn't have much of that to start with. Imagine trying to climb stairs, or go to the bathroom, or escape an angry goose. It's slapstick baked into the sentence. There's one mainstream historical mention of the drunkard's cloak being used in Newcastle upon Tyne during the 1650s under Puritan rule. A man who'd been caught drunk in public was marched through the streets in a barrel guarded by two very sober soldiers. This wasn't just about embarrassment. It was moral instruction in full view. The cloak wasn't just a joke. It was a sermon you could trip over. Historians still argue whether this punishment was common or more of a rare theatrical flourish. Some believe it was more popular in Germany, where there are visual records, woodcuts, and paintings showing cloaked drunkards stumbling through cobblestone squares. Others say it was more myth than mainstream, a cautionary tale told to bargoers the way we now tell scary stories about breathalyzers. But whether it happened often or occasionally, the image stuck. Even centuries later, the term drunkard's cloak pops up in old literature and town records as a shorthand for public embarrassment. It's the precursor to every walk of shame ever completed with a pounding headache and someone else's hat on your head. Here's a quirky side note. In some places, the cloak was used not just for drunks, but also for those who wasted bread, disrespected clergy, or, you guessed it, gossiped. Really, if your behavior didn't fit the ideal social mold, someone was ready with a barrel and a hammer. It became a catch-all garment of judgment, like a really judgy hoodie. And unlike many medieval punishments, the cloak didn't involve blood or bruises. It was psychological. You weren't beaten, you were paraded. You weren't silenced. You were amplified, turned into a walking PSA for temperance and good behavior. Though, depending on your level of intoxication, you might have actually enjoyed the first 10 minutes of it. One recorded offender reportedly turned the tables by singing loudly, and waving at children as he staggered through town in his cloak, treating the whole affair like a festival. The town wasn't amused. They added weights to the bottom of the barrel the next time. So, adjustments were made. Of course, the question lingers, was this kinder than a whipping? Was public mockery more effective than physical pain? Historians debate whether the cloak's true power was in its theatricality or its efficiency. One camp believes it was an innovative way to deter drunkenness without relying on mutilation or imprisonment. Another argues that humiliation, especially in tightly knit villages, left deeper scars than a physical beating ever could. One thing's for sure, the cloak wasn't meant to be forgettable. That barrel stayed in town memory. You'd walk past it for weeks afterward, smelling the faint, sour stink of beer-soaked wood, and think, yep, that's where Dave sang sea shanties until he fell over. Public morality preserved in oak, and just imagine if we brought it back. Friday nights would look a lot different. Instead of Ubers and fast food, you'd see a slow parade of barrel-clad stumblers jostling for balance on their way to nowhere in particular. But in the world of medieval punishment, this one feels almost kind. Almost. No lashes, no iron spikes, just a heavy, awkward costume and the disapproving gaze of your neighbors. It was temporary. It was silly. It was unforgettable. So, as you shuffle out of the square, trying not to trip over your own tunic hem, remember, sometimes justice isn't about pain. Sometimes it's about ridiculous outfits and the long, slow walk of reflection, emphasis on slow. There's an uncomfortable stillness in the church today. Not the usual reverent quiet, but something colder, like even the incense is holding its breath. And then you hear it, the slow drag of wooden feet on stone, the faint clatter of something heavy. You glance up, and there she is. She's not walking freely. Her neck, wrists, and ankles are locked into a hulking contraption of timber and iron. Her head is bowed, and the wooden framework forces her into a kind of permanent curtsy. She's today's penitent, and she's doing her public time in the cucking stool. You shift in your pew uncomfortably, because there, but for the grace of your quiet mouth, go you. The cucking stool, sometimes called the scold's stool, wasn't exactly a chair you'd want in your reading nook. It was a punishment seat, usually made of stout wood, sometimes attached to a long pole or set near a public body of water. If you were particularly lucky, it might be attached to a rolling platform, making it a kind of mobile shame station. And, if you were really lucky, sarcasm alert, you'd be sentenced to its far more notorious cousin, the ducking stool. The difference? Simple. The cucking stool was about being seen. The ducking stool was about being submerged. Women, yes, overwhelmingly, women were strapped into these devices for being scolds. That is for speaking too loudly, complaining, nagging, gossiping, or simply being unpleasant in the eyes of men who wrote the town ordinances. It was the Middle Ages' answer to, "Don't you have something nicer to say?" You'd be placed in the stool sometimes, fully clothed, sometimes not, depending on how vindictive your town was feeling that day, and left there exposed to the elements and to the jeers of passers-by. And, while you're busy contemplating every life choice that led to this moment, a baker tosses a stale roll in your lap. Charming. A mainstream historical reference points to 14th century England, where the cucking stool was a common municipal feature. Some towns even had official stool keepers. Yes, that was a real title, tasked with maintaining the contraption and wheeling it out when judgment was due. A big day for the stool guy. Less so for you. Historians still argue whether the cucking stool was truly about maintaining order or just a socially sanctioned tool for misogyny. One side sees it as a crude form of community discipline, a way to rein in disruptive behavior. The other side sees it as a weapon used primarily against women who dared to speak without permission. And in many cases, both arguments hold weight, sometimes literally, depending on the stool model. But then there's the ducking stool, the aquatic sequel nobody asked for. This version often came with a pivoting arm that extended over a river pond or moat. Once strapped into the chair, you were slowly, very slowly lowered into the water. Then pulled up again. Then dunked again. And again. And again. The punishment didn't always result in injury, but water's not exactly known for being gentle when combined with splinters and iron straps. And in cold months, you were one dunk away from turning into a cautionary popsicle. One particularly quirky historical tidbit: in some English towns, the ducking stool was wheeled through the village before arriving at the water. Like a very grim parade float, complete with snickering children and judgmental widows muttering prayers as you passed. If you happened to be ducked in a spot with a nearby tavern, your misfortune might even be a social event. 7 Pence says she shrieks on the third dip. Classy. And unlike many medieval punishments, the ducking stool wasn't necessarily about proving guilt. It was about enforcing a kind of silence. No trial, no long testimony. Just a sentence of humiliation, usually announced by the local constable or parish authority. It wasn't about whether you were innocent. It was about whether someone thought you talked too much. Let that settle for a second. Imagine being dunked in a cold pond because your neighbor didn't like how you asked for your cheese back. Now, scholars do note that in a few cases, very few men were also sentenced to the stool. Usually for fraud, abusive behavior, or being exceptionally disruptive in public. But statistically, women filled most of the seats. Because when it came to the enforcement of silence, the gender lines were drawn in heavy ink. That said, there's some debate about whether the stool was meant to be a one-time correction or an escalating punishment. Some records suggest it was issued as a first warning. Others hint that repeated stool sessions could lead to harsher sentences, fines, whipping, even imprisonment. So in a way, this chair could be your gateway punishment. Like a trial period for people who needed to learn their place. And then there's the architectural irony. These stools were often stored near town halls or churches, tucked just out of sight yet always available when morality needed a little public theater. Imagine storing a dunking chair next to the hymnals and communion wine. Nothing says grace like adjacent humiliation. Of course, if you were lucky or well-connected, you might be spared. Not everyone sentenced to the stool ended up soaked or shamed. Occasionally, townsfolk protested. There's one record from Devonshire where a woman was pulled from the chair by her neighbors before the procession even reached the river. Small-town solidarity, medieval style. And while we think of these punishments as grim relics, their echoes lasted well into the 18th century. Some towns held on to their ducking stools as municipal artifacts, symbols of the good old days of community discipline. Which, frankly, says more about nostalgia than justice. So, as you picture that heavy wooden contraption rolling toward the riverbank, the ropes creaking, the crowd buzzing with anticipation, remember this: sometimes kindness in punishment was measured not by whether it hurt your body, but by whether it simply left you wet cold and too embarrassed to complain. Better than a branding iron. Probably better than being ignored entirely. That depends on how fond you are of dry socks. Your hands are trembling, but not from fear. Well, not exactly. It's more the anticipation, the absurdity of it all. You've never been publicly shamed before, and you certainly never thought it would happen because of pie. But here you are, standing awkwardly in the village square with a crusty badge pinned to your cloak. It reads, Baker of Short Wait. And you've just become the star of one of the strangest medieval rituals, the public punishment of dishonest tradesmen. Let's set the scene. You're a baker in, say, 13th century London. Business is good. The flour's a bit low quality, but hey, times are tough. So you shave off a little weight here. Substitute a little oat for wheat there. No one will notice, right? Wrong. Because today's market inspector, known cheerfully as the ale conner or bread weigher, is unusually sharp-eyed. He plucks one of your loaves from your stall and drops it on his scales. It's light. Too light. And within the hour you're facing the stocks, or worse, the assize of bread and ale. Yes, that was a real law. Passed in 1266 under Henry III, the assize of bread and ale established precise weight requirements for loaves and strict quality standards for both bread and beer. It was one of the earliest attempts at consumer protection, and violations were taken seriously. Very seriously. For minor offenses, you might be publicly named and shamed, sometimes with signs, sometimes with bells, and, in some regions, with a symbolic punishment that involved exactly what you think it does, being dragged through town on a sledge made from your own bread oven's door. Let's talk about that for a moment. Imagine being lashed to a flat iron slab once used to bake sourdoughs and rye loaves, and pulled through muddy streets like a human pretzel. It's heavy. It's hot from the morning's batch. And worse, your neighbors are watching. Some are laughing. Others are haggling with your competitors who are now waving their honest loaves high in the air like moral trophies. The symbolism is rich. You cheat with your oven, you ride your oven. Poetic in that medieval justice kind of way. Sometimes your bread was paraded in front of you like an accusatory prop. Behold, this is the loaf of lies a crier might declare, hoisting the underweight bread like it had personally insulted the crown. And, if you were unlucky enough to be a repeat offender, the punishments escalated fines, stocks, pillories, or a very public banning from your trade guild. A mainstream historical fact, in many medieval towns, especially in England and Flanders, the bread laws were strictly enforced not just for fairness, but to prevent food riots. Bread was life. If bakers cheated, the whole system unraveled. The Black Death might have reduced populations, but bread riots were what truly kept city officials awake at night. Historians still argue whether these punishments were genuinely effective or mostly theatrical. Some say the oven door dragging happened, rarely an urban legend repeated to scare apprentices into obedience. Others claim the ritual was very real, particularly in towns where trade guilds had their own quasi-legal authority and loved a good spectacle. And it wasn't just bakers. Alewives, female brewers, often working from their homes, were regularly targeted under the same laws. If your beer was watered down or your measures off, you could be forced to wear a necklace of broken pots, or have your ale publicly poured out in front of your stall. The worst part, you had to watch. That's not just wasteful, it's heartbreaking. There's a charmingly ridiculous case from the city of Chester, where dishonest alewives were made to crawl through the market square, holding a fake tankard, shouting, "I sold weak ale," in a sing-song voice. As far as branding goes, it's memorable. As far as dignity, not so much. And if you think the punishments were limited to food and drink, think again. butchers who sold rotten meat fishmongers with slimy cod, even candle makers who thinned their wax all found themselves at the business end of a good public humiliation. Sometimes they were forced to wear their own goods. Yes, there are accounts of fishmongers wearing necklaces of spoiled herring. That's not just gross, that's weaponized stench. Here's a quirky tidbit: some guilds had their own punishment garments, robes stitched with symbols of shame like crooked scales or half loaves. You'd have to wear it while you stood at your stall, basically turning you into a walking billboard that said, "Buyer beware, this one's dodgy." Now, you might be thinking, at least they weren't flogged or imprisoned. And you'd be right, sort of. These punishments were designed to hurt the wallet and the ego, not the body. They relied on embarrassment, loss of reputation, and in some cases an alarming amount of mud. For a medieval merchant whose survival depended on repeat business, that was a serious blow. It's a strangely kind of punishment if you squint. No broken bones, no missing fingers. Just a strong lesson delivered with a theatrical flourish and a little public heckling. Plus, a surprisingly literal interpretation of face the consequences. And unlike other punishments of the time, these were very community-driven. The crowd was part of the process. Justice was a shared performance. Everyone got to feel a little morally superior for a day. I might gossip, someone would whisper, but at least I don't short the bread. So, as you dust off the last crumb from your shame sign and hope no one immortalized this in a tapestry, take heart, you probably won't be dragged again. Just make sure tomorrow's loaves are full weight and round. The bread inspector is coming again, and he's got a scale and a memory. Your eyes are watering not from emotion, but from the sharp stink of onions crushed beneath your feet. There's a lot to be confused about in this moment. The rough hemp tunic chafing your skin, the chicken feathers glued to your cap, and the small, very smug goat tied to your waist. You're part of the most bizarre spectacle this village has seen all week. The punishment of a bad musician, or rather, someone who claimed to be a musician. But when you stood in the town square with your battered lute and cracked voice offering tunes for coin, it became painfully obvious, both for you and for the crowd, that you were more croak than chord. So here you are, part of a strangely festive mockery march called the Charivari. If that sounds like a fancy French dessert, think again. This was an uproarious, satirical parade designed to humiliate wrongdoers, not with chains or blood, but with noise farce and barnyard-level pageantry. The Charivari, or rough music as it was known in England, had many faces. But at its core, it was about social correction through absurdity. Not handed down by a judge mind, this was folk justice. The kind administered by neighbors with too much time, too many pots to bang, and very firm opinions about public decency and off-key ballads. The event you're in right now. It's a punishment for fraud, a self-declared minstrel who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. Other times, this punishment was reserved for men who beat their wives, women who nagged excessively. Here we go again, or newlyweds with significant age differences that scandalized the village sensibilities. And sometimes, people who simply lived together outside of marriage found themselves serenaded by this strange chorus of judgment. A mainstream historical fact, charivaris were most common in France, Germany, and the British Isles between the 12th and 17th centuries, especially in rural areas where formal justice was distant or disinterested. They weren't technically legal punishments, but they carried a kind of cultural legitimacy enough that local authorities often turned a blind eye unless things got particularly out of hand. Which, spoiler alert, they often did. The ritual began with gathering a crowd. The bigger and rowdier, the better. Then came the noisemakers banging pots, pans, bells, bones, drums, basically anything loud and discordant. Add in a few horns, a broken fiddle or two, and a chorus of deliberately awful singing, and you've got the rough music ensemble ready to roll. Targets of a charivari were sometimes paraded on a donkey backward, of course, to make the humiliation more potent, or made to ride in a wheelbarrow pushed through the village. People would pelt them with soft fruit dump buckets of ash or feathers over their heads, or just hurl clever insults while playing out exaggerated scenes of the alleged misbehavior. Your scene. A staged recital where your fellow villagers dressed as cats and geese parody your musical act using spoons and yowls. One fellow keeps trying to harmonize with the goat who is deeply unimpressed. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, the charivari involved dressing the offender in women's clothes, especially if the man was seen as having behaved unmanly or beneath his station. One tale from Bavaria describes a farmer forced to wear his wife's Sunday dress while pushing a wheelbarrow full of manure through town, all because he skipped church to nap in the hayloft. The moral: don't sleep in on sermon day. Apparently, historians still argue whether the charivari was a tool of community cohesion or cruelty in disguise. On the one hand, it upheld local standards and allowed a kind of communal catharsis without permanent damage. On the other, it could cross into bullying, even violence. Some accounts tell of homes being stoned, livestock stolen, and entire families forced to move after particularly vicious charivaris. In some rare cases, the charivari wasn't punishment, but a celebration with new couples subjected to it as a kind of noisy blessing. But even these joyful versions could be laced with sarcasm. If a much older man married a young woman, for instance, the charivari might include a staged funeral for his youth, complete with a coffin filled with old boots and a eulogy delivered by the village drunk. And that's the thing, charivaris blurred the lines between justice satire and social theater. They were part performance art, part mob mentality, part therapy session for an overworked peasant class that needed somewhere to aim their frustrations. You standing there now with a tambourine strapped to your foot and a chicken pecking your ankle are just the unfortunate center of today's drama. There's no formal end to a charivari. Sometimes it fades with the sunset, the crowd drifting off with satisfied giggles. Sometimes it ends when the target makes a public apology or buys a round at the local tavern. Occasionally, someone throws a punch and the whole affair collapses into a brawl, at which point the local reeve finally decides he's had enough and hauls everyone to the stocks. But for the most part, the punishment was the noise itself, the ridiculousness, the humiliation through parody, not pain. You didn't leave with scars, just with a bruised ego and a powerful desire never to mess up your social standing again, and in a way that makes the charivari oddly kind. Sure, you looked like an absolute fool, but you got to keep your fingers your trade and your home. You just had to deal with being called goat bard for the next year and a half. Fair trade. As the goat tugs on the rope and the crowd begins to dissolve into the evening mist, you realize something: you'll never fake a lute performance again. Not because the law told you not to, but because Brenda, the blacksmith's wife, is still carrying that drum, and you swear she's got a second verse ready. Your arms ache not from hard labor, but from holding them out at shoulder height for what feels like hours. And what are you holding? Stones. Just stones. Not boulders, not weights with some fancy moral inscription, just two awkward lumps of rock handed to you by a man in an itchy woolen robe, who claimed very seriously that this was the Lord's justice. Welcome to one of the most deceptively gentle punishments in medieval Europe, enforced penance by posture. You're standing just outside the village chapel, in full view of passers-by arms, outstretched like a scarecrow after a long weekend. Your crime gossip. Specifically starting a rumor that the miller's wife has been sneaking extra flour for her sister in the next village. Whether it's true or not is beside the point. You spoke without proof. You sowed social chaos. So now you must stand humbled, bearing the weight of your words literally. This wasn't some fringe ritual either. Posture-based penances were fairly widespread across medieval Christendom, especially in smaller parishes with limited legal authority. These punishments weren't about physical pain so much as spiritual symbolism. Holding stones. It meant you carried the burden of sin. Kneeling on grains or sharp tiles, that meant humility. Climbing the church steps on your knees. Repentance one bruised kneecap at a time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 12th century, penance had become a formalized part of Christian life, thanks in part to guidelines issued by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This council encouraged regular confession and penance, ideally annual, and granted significant power to local priests and bishops to assign penances for all manner of misbehavior. And let's just say, creativity flourished. Your current punishment likely comes from a local priest rather than a civil court. The Church handled a great deal of moral justice in this period, especially when it came to sins of the tongue, gossip, slander, heresy, blasphemy. Rather than imprison or flog you, the Church preferred to put you on display in a posture both uncomfortable and unmistakably remorseful. But not all postural penances were stationary. Sometimes you'd be forced to walk a public route barefoot, carrying a candle the size of a cornstalk to the nearest cathedral. Or drag a cross wooden ruff and not quite the size of Calvary's, but enough to draw eyes and nods of recognition. Sometimes the candle dripped hot wax on your hand. Not enough to scar, but enough to sting. Enough to remember. There's one particularly odd case from medieval Florence where a woman convicted of vanity, too much rouge, too many ribbons, not enough humility, was sentenced to walk barefoot from her home to the city's main cathedral, wearing a sackcloth dress and holding a mirror turned inward. Symbolism stacked on symbolism. She wasn't even allowed to speak unless asked a question by the priest. Silence, he said, becomes her best ornament. Quirky tidbit time. In some alpine villages, penance included standing barefoot in a stream regardless of the season while reciting the Lord's Prayer for every family you had offended. That could mean 20 minutes of ice-cold self-reflection while trout peered at your ankles in mild confusion. And of course, not all of these rituals were even punitive. Some were requested voluntarily, particularly by nobles seeking forgiveness for large sins, breaking oaths, waging war on fellow Christians, or accidentally torching a monastery during a wine-fueled raid. It happens. These voluntary penances were grand, long pilgrimages, generous donations, or symbolic acts of humility, like kissing the feet of lepers or publicly washing beggars' clothes. Historians still argue whether these posture-based punishments were effective deterrents or performative pageantry. On the one hand, they offered a clean slate, a public washing away of sin. On the other, they often became spectacle. People came to watch. They snickered. Some even brought food and made a day of it, especially in larger towns where humiliation was the closest thing to live theater. But the real genius of these punishments was how they weaponized stillness. Pain fades. Movement ends. But posture lingers. You remember what it's like to hold a stone until your fingers cramp, to kneel until your bones ache, to feel the judging gaze of a cobbler's apprentice who's 12 and definitely writing a ballad about you. That's the kind of shame that burns itself into your muscles. In this moment, you shift slightly. Just a nudge. The priest frowns. No fidgeting, he mutters. Sin does not squirm its way out. You smile a little because that's actually kind of poetic, but quickly refocus before he adds another hour to your vigil. And while you stand there, something strange happens. At first, you feel like a joke. Then, slowly, you start to feel something else. Not guilt exactly, but awareness. That maybe words matter. That maybe wagging your tongue about other people's lives just because the mill's quiet and the afternoon is long isn't the best use of your breath. Or maybe you're just getting delirious from dehydration. Honestly, both are plausible. Nearby, a woman approaches. She's holding a small flask of water. She offers it with a raised brow. The priest says nothing. You tilt your head in thanks. No words, because that too is part of the punishment. Eventually, the bell rings. Time's up. The priest nods. You may lower your arms. The stones drop with a satisfying thud. You wince, shake out your fingers, and rub your shoulders like they've been cranked by medieval Pilates. You're free to go. No blood, no stocks, no fine. Just aching muscles, and a story you'll never live down. They'll probably call you Stony Susan or the Gossip Gargoyle for a while. But at least you've still got your job at the laundry, and your toes are intact. All in all, as far as medieval punishments go, this one wasn't so bad. Maybe even thoughtful. A punishment meant to make you pause. Literally. You turn dust off your tunic and walk home with shoulders just a little straighter. A little more careful, and definitely more skeptical about mill gossip. You've just been handed a small wooden paddle about the size of a dinner plate, but thicker, heavier, and far less appetizing. It's called a penalty paddle, and your job is to sit down bare backside first and accept the careful, deliberate smack it's about to deliver. Welcome to the world of corporal punishment by the cucking stool, a peculiar medieval method reserved mainly for a certain class of offenders, disorderly women, and scolds, otherwise known as those pesky naggers or gossip mongers who wouldn't take a hint to zip it. You might be thinking, well, corporal punishment, how kind is that? And you'd be right to wonder. But the cucking stool wasn't all paddle and pain. It was also an early version of public humiliation with a splash. The stool was a chair attached to a long beam that could be tipped to dunk the offender into the nearest pond or river. Sometimes it was just a dunking device. Other times it incorporated the paddle. Think of it as the medieval version of a combo plate pane, public shaming, and a cold bath. The cucking stool dates back at least to the 13th century in England and parts of continental Europe, and it was primarily aimed at women accused of being scolds, a term loosely applied to women who talked too much, argued, or disturbed the peace. Men got their share of punishment, but scolding was considered a woman's crime and a threat to societal order. Here's a mainstream fact. The word scold comes from the Old Norse skald, meaning a poet or storyteller. But medieval society took a dim view of women who dared to be vocal, especially if they criticized or contradicted men. The cucking stool was a means to silence and shame them, often administered by the local parish or manor court. You're strapped into this chair, the plank positioned over the water. The crowd gathers, some sympathetic others snickering, and a few making bets on how many dips you'll take. As the cucking stool tips, the chill of the water shocks your system, but it's the laughter and the feeling of being a spectacle that truly stings. But the cucking stool wasn't just for punishment. In some communities, it was also a test. If the accused sank and almost drowned, she was sometimes declared innocent of witchcraft because the water accepted her. Historians still argue whether this was truly widespread or a later myth. Of course, if you floated well, you were in deeper trouble. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some Dutch villages, the cucking stool was called the ducking stool, and sometimes featured a puppet or a doll strapped in alongside the offender to add a little theatrical flair and mockery. The ducking sessions could last for hours, with the chair repeatedly dipped while neighbors pelted the unfortunate victim with rotten eggs or cabbages. There's also evidence that the cucking stool was sometimes used for men, particularly those accused of perjury or cheating at cards. So, the next time you're losing a game, be glad you live in a less splashy era. Historians still debate the gender dynamics of the cucking stool. Some argue it was a weaponized tool to control women in a patriarchal society. Others see it as a community-driven way to maintain order and deter disruptive behavior regardless of gender. It's likely a bit of both reflecting both societal control and grassroots justice. But unlike harsher punishments like stocks or branding, the cucking stool left no permanent marks. Its sting was momentary, but effective, a chilling reminder that society preferred a splash of humiliation over a lifetime of scars. And, well, a cold bath. As you sit there dripping, you can't help but notice the irony, a punishment that cools your temper by soaking your behind. Maybe medieval justice had a twisted sense of humor after all. You're standing under the merciless sun in the middle of a busy market square, barefoot on the dusty stones, and suddenly you realize just how many eyes are on you. They're not just looking, they're judging, waiting. Why? Because you're about to wear the branks, or as it's sometimes called, the scold's bridle, a punishment so inventive and bizarre. It almost seems like medieval torture was a creative art form. The branks is a metal cage or mask fitted tightly over your head, with a sharp tongue-shaped piece forced inside your mouth to prevent speech. Its purpose: to silence scolds, or women who were deemed too outspoken gossipers, or those who dared to publicly challenge the social order. You might think this punishment is cruel, and historians agree, but they also note that it was intended to prevent further verbal sins in a way less bloody than branding or flogging. Here's your mainstream fact. The branks were most commonly used in Scotland and northern England from the 16th to the 18th centuries, often as an extension of the legal system's attempt to police female behavior. The device was locked on, often with a padlock, making it impossible to talk, eat, or drink without assistance. Imagine the muffled screams and desperate attempts at communication sleep talk took on a whole new meaning here. You're marched through the village, the iron rattling with every step, drawing curious and sympathetic looks alike. The crowd whispers and points, some snickering behind their hands, others shaking their heads in pity. The humiliation is public, inescapable, and brutal. Unlike the cucking stool, which at least offered a quick dunk and release, the branks could be worn for hours or even days. A quirky tidbit. In some places, the branks was elaborately decorated with inscriptions or even a bell attached to it which rang as the wearer moved, amplifying the public spectacle. One English town reputedly added iron horns to the branks, mocking the horned scold. Talk about medieval trolling. There's also an argument among scholars about whether the branks was used primarily for women, or if men who spoke out of turn ever got the same treatment. Some records mention male offenders, but overwhelmingly it was a tool of controlling women's speech, a chilling reminder of the gender dynamics at play in medieval justice. Historians still debate how common the branks really were. Some suggest it was a relatively rare punishment, more symbolic than routine, while others argue that its presence in local museums and court records indicates a broader and more systematic use. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, with the branks becoming a notorious symbol of social control rather than an everyday sentence. As the sun sets and the crowd disperses, you can still feel the weight of the iron, a cold, biting reminder that some medieval punishments were designed to silence not just the body, but the very voice that carried dissent. And just as you think you can't take another moment with this confining device, you realize that freedom is not just the removal of the iron, but the return of your own voice. The ability to speak without fear, to whisper secrets, or simply to grumble under your breath. You swear you'll think twice before opening your mouth next time, but deep down you know that silence, after all, isn't always golden. The village square smells of damp earth and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs as you're brought forward hands bound with rough hemp cords. Today's punishment doesn't involve blood or bruises, but it does require standing completely still sometimes for hours, chained to a large wooden post called the pillory. You might have heard the term tossed around in history shows, but experiencing it firsthand, that's a different kind of test. The pillory was a device used throughout medieval Europe, primarily to punish petty thieves' liars, or anyone caught cheating at the market. Your head and hands are locked into wooden holes, leaving you exposed and immobile. You're the village's open book displayed for public scrutiny. Imagine holding your neck in a wooden frame, your hands pinned, forced to face the sneering crowd who throws rotten fruit mud, or occasionally an overly ambitious turnip. The mainstream historical fact here: pillories date back to at least the 13th century, and were used as a form of public shaming and deterrence. The goal was social humiliation more than lasting physical damage, although the crowd's generosity with projectiles could make it quite painful. In England, this punishment was common until the 18th century, but earlier medieval records show widespread use across France, Germany, and Italy too. Now for a quirky tidbit. In some towns, the pillory came with a dunce cap, a tall pointed hat made of wood or cardboard, often painted with a ridiculous face or slogan. This added insult to injury, turning you not only into a motionless target, but a walking punchline. Sometimes the dunce cap would be festooned with feathers or bells, making your humiliation loud and colorful. Historians still argue about the pillory's effectiveness. Did it really deter crime, or was it mostly a public spectacle that encouraged rowdy behavior? Some evidence suggests that the pillory could actually backfire. Crowds often sympathized with the punished, especially if they believed the sentence unfair, and might even cheer them on or defend them. In rare cases, the pillory could become a stage for resistance rather than submission. Speaking of resistance, you notice the subtle ways people express solidarity with the pilloried: a wink from the baker, a tossed loaf of bread instead of rotten eggs, a whispered prayer. Sometimes these small acts can turn the humiliation into a moment of community support, a brief reprieve from isolation. And there's the sensory detail: the wood's rough grain biting into your skin, the sun beating down on your neck, the occasional fly landing on your face, and that ever-present sound of murmurs, laughter, and sometimes cruel taunts swirling in your ears. You try to find comfort in the breeze that carries away some of the stink from the nearby livestock market. You wonder what made you worthy of this fate. Maybe it was a missing coin, a sharp word, or a small act of defiance. The exact nature of your crime might never matter as much as the ritual of punishment itself. After what feels like forever, the wooden gates open and the jailer comes to release you. Your joints are stiff, your pride dented, but you're free to go. You rub your wrists, marveling at the bruises left by the wood, and start walking home under a sky that seems just a little less friendly than before. Still, despite the pain and shame, you're grateful for the absence of bloodshed. The pillory is harsh, yes, but it's a kind of justice that leaves your body intact and your story to tell, warts and all. As you turn the corner, you can't help but wonder which would be worse: the quiet sting of a posture penance, or the loud humiliation of the pillory. Luckily, that's a debate for another day. The morning air is crisp and smells faintly of burnt wood and damp straw as you are led to the town's public square, where a curious contraption awaits a large wooden wheel suspended horizontally on a sturdy frame. This is the infamous breaking wheel, a device that promises a punishment both brutal and slow. Yet it was often reserved for the most serious offenders, especially those accused of heinous crimes like murder or treason. However, the use of the wheel varied greatly across medieval Europe, sometimes surprisingly moderated. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, was widely used across Germany, France, and the Low Countries during the late Middle Ages. The condemned was tied to the wheel, and their limbs were shattered by a heavy iron cudgel or hammer, then left to die slowly as the wheel was displayed as a grim warning. But there's a twist to this terrifying story. In some regions, judges chose to spare the worst physical harm, opting instead to use the wheel more as a means of public shaming and intimidation rather than actual mutilation. Imagine your wrists and ankles being bound to the spokes of this cold, unforgiving frame. The crowd gathers whispering about your crime, some shaking their heads in sorrow, others rubbing their hands with anticipation. The executioner raises his club, and you brace yourself not just for pain, but for the humiliation of being on full display, vulnerable in body and spirit. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some accounts, the wheel was also used symbolically. Without the crushing blows, offenders were tied to it and paraded around town, or simply left suspended for a few hours to mark their disgrace. This softer use of the wheel challenges our modern assumptions about medieval cruelty, showing how punishments could be adapted to suit local customs and sensibilities. Historians still argue about the prevalence of these softer punishments. Some suggest they were common in towns seeking to avoid the international stigma of brutal executions, while others believe such moderation was rare and exceptional. The truth likely varies by region and era. There's also a certain poetry to the wheel's design. It could be spun slowly to display the offender from every angle, turning their shame into a revolving spectacle. For the audience, it was theater. For the punished, a relentless spotlight. Sensory details matter here. The rough wood pressing into your skin, the cold metal of your bonds, the cacophony of the crowd, some sobbing, some jeering, and the distant clang of the church bell marking the hour. Time slows. Your breath catches. The world narrows to the cold touch of rope and the creak of the wheel. As the minutes stretch on, you realize the physical agony is only one part of the sentence. The real punishment is exposure being seen as broken, both literally and figuratively, unable to hide from judgment. When the ordeal ends, you're lowered carefully to the ground. Your body aches, bruised but unbroken, and the crowd slowly disperses the weight of the moment sinking in. The wheel, once a symbol of dread, now stands silent, and still waiting for its next unfortunate passenger. You limp away, grateful for breath, for pain that will fade, and for a chance, however slim, to rebuild a life shadowed by public disgrace. The cold stone walls of the dungeon seem to close in on you as you sit strapped to a wooden frame. This is no ordinary chair. It's the infamous Iron Maiden, a device you probably associate with medieval torture chambers, all spikes and horror. But here's a medieval twist. Despite its terrifying reputation, historians now question how often or even if the Iron Maiden was actually used in medieval Europe. Some argue it's more a product of later sensationalism than a genuine medieval punishment. The Iron Maiden. If you imagine it as a coffin-shaped iron cabinet, studded with spikes on the inside, was supposedly designed to impale the victim slowly and painfully as the doors closed. The reality might be less gory, but just as grim. The Iron Maiden appears more in 18th and 19th century descriptions and was likely a creation of the Romantic imagination, used to illustrate barbaric medieval cruelty rather than document actual practice. That said, similar devices did exist in various forms chairs with spikes to force stillness cages to confine and torment. But they were not as widespread or as dramatic as the legends suggest. The idea of the Iron Maiden captured the imagination precisely because it combined the horror of imprisonment with the dread of sharp metal. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval torture typically focused on more direct means, whipping, burning, or crushing, rather than elaborate, spike-filled contraptions. The Iron Maiden's actual existence in the Middle Ages remains hotly debated among scholars, with many considering it an 18th century myth fueled by an appetite for medieval grotesquerie. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some German towns, there were spiked chairs or chairs of torture used to punish petty criminals or heretics by forcing them to sit painfully still for hours. The spikes were not designed to kill, but to inflict discomfort and encourage confession or repentance. Historians still debate the extent to which such devices were tools of punishment versus instruments of intimidation. Were they practical implements or symbolic horrors used to enforce obedience by fear? The answer likely depends on locality and the temperament of the local magistrates. As you sit, confined in this iron embrace, the cold metal presses against your skin. The spikes dangerously close, but not piercing. The silence is broken only by your shallow breaths and the distant echoes of footsteps in the corridor. You try to keep still, fighting off the urge to shift and relieve the mounting discomfort. Your mind drifts to stories told by travelers, tales of macabre prisons and torturous devices designed to extract confessions or punish dissent. The Iron Maiden is often at the center of these stories, a symbol of cruelty more myth than reality. Yet the fear it inspired was very real, proving how reputation alone could serve as a form of control. The sensory experience is stark. The bitter chill of iron, the smell of damp stone and rust, the faint buzz of torchlight flickering on metal surfaces. You imagine how the medieval condemned must have felt caught between legend and harsh reality. As time drags on, you realize this punishment's power lies not in physical destruction, but in psychological torment. Fear of pain, uncertainty of what's next, and the relentless pressure to confess or submit. When you're finally released, your body aches, but it's your mind that carries the deeper scars, proof that medieval punishments were as much about breaking wills as breaking bodies. You find yourself walking slowly through a dimly lit medieval town, the clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones mixing with the soft murmur of market chatter. Suddenly, you're stopped at the edge of a street facing a giant wooden barrel set upright and outfitted with holes cut out for your head and arms. This is the drunkard's cloak, a punishment designed not with pain in mind, but with public humiliation and discomfort, especially for those who had indulged one time too many in the village tavern. The drunkard's cloak was a heavy cylindrical barrel often trimmed with iron hoops, and the offender had to wear it in public wandering the streets while everyone watched, pointed, and sometimes laughed. Unlike harsher punishments, it wasn't about breaking bones or spilling blood, but about exposing a minor social offender to the whole town, and it was used primarily for public drunkenness or minor disorderly conduct. Here's a mainstream historical fact: the drunkard's cloak was particularly common in 16th and 17th century England and parts of Northern Europe, including the Netherlands. Local authorities used it as a way to shame habitual drunkards without resorting to jail or physical punishment. You could think of it as the medieval equivalent of getting your photo posted on social media, but with a lot more public humiliation and a lot less chance of taking the picture down. You might find it surprising, but the drunkard's cloak could weigh anywhere from 40 to 70 pounds, making it physically uncomfortable to wear for extended periods. Carrying that much weight, struggling to walk through narrow streets while everyone is staring, was punishment enough. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, the barrel was even filled partially with water, or had iron bands tightened to make it more restrictive. Sometimes the offender was paraded around on a cart with the cloak on, turning the spectacle into a slow, humiliating parade. In certain villages, the barrel might be decorated with slogans, or even with crude caricatures painted on the wood. Historians still debate how effective the drunkard's cloak was as a deterrent. Some argue it shamed offenders enough to curb drunkenness in the community, while others suggest it simply made the wearer the object of ridicule without addressing the root causes. Either way, it was a punishment that combined social control with a physical burden. Imagine the sensory experience: the rough wood rubbing against your neck and arms, the barrel's weight pulling you down, the noise of laughter and whispers swirling around you. The air smells faintly of ale and horse manure, and the sun beats down mercilessly on your exposed skin, making the heavy barrel feel even hotter and more oppressive. Despite the obvious discomfort, the drunkard's cloak was probably preferable to harsher penalties like whipping or jail time, which often came with worse social consequences. Still, you'd rather not be the one wearing it, wandering past neighbors who'd never let you forget your mistake. And as you stumble forward, awkward and heavy, you can't help but appreciate the peculiar creativity medieval societies used to keep order, and how sometimes the punishment was less about pain and more about sheer embarrassment. The gray sky presses down on the narrow street where you're about to face a punishment that seems almost considerate, at least by medieval standards. It's the shame stool, a simple wooden chair placed in the center of town or the churchyard, designed to hold you in plain view of passers-by for a set time, sometimes hours, sometimes days. This is public shaming in its most basic, almost benign form. Yet, it carries with it the full weight of social condemnation. The shame stool was often used for minor offenses like petty theft or social disputes that didn't warrant physical punishment but still needed correction. Unlike the pillory or the branks, which forcibly silenced or immobilized the shame stool, confined you only in place, allowing speech but not escape from the sharp gazes and whispered judgments. Mainstream historical fact. The shame stool's use is well documented in English and German villages from the 14th century onward, reflecting a widespread practice of nonviolent punishment aimed at community reintegration through humiliation. It's the medieval precursor to being called out on social media, or having your misdeeds announced publicly, but with the added discomfort of having to sit still and take it all in. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, the shame stool was outfitted with bells or whistles that the punished had to wear or carry, announcing their presence everywhere they went. This way, even if they left the stool, the social stigma followed. In other places, the chair was painted bright red, or adorned with crude carvings meant to mock the offender further. Historians still argue whether such punishments genuinely rehabilitated or simply deepened social rifts. Some suggest the shame stool fostered empathy, as the community saw the offender's remorse, while others believe it could harden resentment and alienation. Sensory detail floods in the rough-hewn wood of the stool, presses uncomfortably against your backside. The chill of the stone pavement beneath your feet creeps up through your shoes. Voices murmur nearby, some sympathetic, others scornful. The smell of smoke from a nearby hearth mingles with the faint scent of wet leaves on the wind. You watch as neighbors pause, some shaking their heads, others avoiding eye contact but all aware of the spectacle. You realize that sitting there isn't just punishment. It's a forced moment of reflection, a slow acceptance of community judgment. Your mind drifts to the strange kindness in this punishment. No blood spilled, no bones broken, just a demand for patience and humility. It's a reminder that medieval justice wasn't always about pain, but often about maintaining social order with the tools of shame and time. When finally released, you feel the stiffness in your legs and the prickling awareness of every eye that had studied you. The shame stool leaves marks on your pride. Not your flesh, sometimes harder to heal, but no less effective. As you rise and walk away, you carry a new understanding of punishment's power beyond pain. How silence, stillness, and the weight of watching eyes can shape behavior in ways both subtle and profound. The afternoon sun filters weakly through high, narrow windows of the town hall, where you stand, accused once more this time, facing an unusual and surprisingly kind form of medieval justice, the ducking stool. Unlike the harsh punishments you've faced, the ducking stool was designed to deal mostly with a specific kind of troublemaker. Usually, women accused of scolding, gossiping, or being common nags in the community. The irony is that although it sounds like a form of torture, this punishment had an almost playful, if humiliating, edge. The ducking stool was a chair attached to a long wooden lever or beam, positioned over a pond or river. You are strapped in, and then the lever is operated to dunk you repeatedly underwater, sometimes just briefly, sometimes longer, depending on the local customs and the accused's offense. This was meant as a way to cleanse your sins, figuratively drowning the bad behavior out of you. The mainstream historical fact ducking stools were commonly used in England and parts of continental Europe from the 15th to the 18th century, primarily to punish disorderly women, but occasionally men too. Although it sounds severe, many records show the dunking was relatively quick and intended more to frighten and embarrass than to inflict serious harm. A quirky tidbit: in some towns, the ducking stool was used in a sort of public ceremony, with crowds gathering to watch the nags get a splashy lesson in humility. In certain places, there was even a ritualistic element with a designated dunking master, who would administer the punishment with comic exaggeration, turning it into a bizarre community spectacle that bordered on performance art. Historians still argue whether the ducking stool was truly a form of justice or more a tool of patriarchal control, aimed at silencing women and reinforcing social norms. Some modern scholars suggest it was less about punishment and more about public shaming and reinforcing gender roles. Imagine the sensory experience, the chill of water rushing over your skin, the rough bark of the wooden stool digging into your thighs, the gasps and laughter from the crowd echoing in your ears. The smell of mud, reeds, and fresh water blends oddly with the faint scent of burning torches nearby. As you're plunged underwater, your breath hitches heart racing, not from physical pain, but from the sharp sting of humiliation and fear. You wonder what it must have been like for those dunked multiple times, or for those who had no pond to escape to left dangling over cold, freezing water. After you're hauled out, dripping and shivering, you shiver from more than cold, you're chilled by the knowledge that the community has witnessed your lesson. Still, you're grateful that the punishment stopped short of permanent harm. Looking back at the ducking stool, you realize it was a punishment walking the fine line between cruelty and kindness, a medieval balancing act between justice, social order, and public spectacle. As the sun dips lower, you step away from the riverbank, your clothes clinging wetly to your skin, and you feel the weight of the day's journey through medieval punishments. Odd, often harsh, yet sometimes surprisingly gentle in their own strange way. Now let's ease down with a soft closing. You're lying back now, the day fading gently away. The medieval world, with all its peculiar punishments, slips quietly into shadow as your mind drifts. The heavy wooden wheels, the sharp iron spikes, the cold river water. They all grow distant, like echoes of a far-off story told by candlelight. There's comfort in knowing that despite the harshness, these punishments often sought to restore order, not simply to harm. And sometimes, in their strange ways, they showed a flicker of kindness or mercy, an odd balance between justice and humanity. Breathe deeply now. Feel the calm spread through you, the soft hum of the night wrapping around your thoughts like a warm blanket. The past is behind you. The quiet present invites rest. Sleep well safe from pillories, wheels, and dunking stools. Let your dreams carry you gently into tomorrow.